Hey everyone, glad to be here with you once again tonight for yet another conversation. Should be good. Certain days here. I got a little bit to say about it. So yeah, let's do it. Let's have another late night chat.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
And we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. I am so glad to be here tonight. I am still enjoying the holiday mode. I must say, had a very relaxing day. We had our first meeting about the Minnesota CPI workshop. It's going to be taking place in February. We had a meeting to discuss that this morning. That was pretty good. We're preparing for our inauguration event. A lot of exciting things are happening. A lot of crazy stuff is happening in the world, which I have plenty to say about, and we'll get to that later. But as you all know, the way these streams work, first I give my opening remarks. Then after that, there is a roll call, and we find out who is on the other side of the camera, who's watching. And then after that, I answer your super chat questions for the remainder of the night. So if you have something you'd like me to comment on, send a super chat. Last night was a great example of a great show. You guys asked some really good questions. You got me talking, and it was pretty awesome, I thought. We went for almost 3 hours last night, and I answered a lot of questions and spoke my mind on a lot of things, and we as a community went on a great journey together. And I will emphasize that what we do here on this channel is very collective, for sure. This is not just me on here talking. If that was the case, I would film it and upload it afterwards. I am interacting with all of you, and that's what makes this special. It's what makes this beautiful. And it is my ability to interact with all of you on here night after night. We develop certain themes. We learn about topics together. We have running jokes. We do all of that. It's really, really great. And our community has come a long way. It's been a long ride. I believe last night was episode 846. Can you believe this? 846 episodes of this live stream have happened. 846. This will be 847 tonight. Holy moly. We have been here and we have grown together, and we've been through ups and downs and thicks and thins, and we just keep scoring great victories, and we just keep getting better. So I'm really, really happy with our community. As far as announcements, you all know the big thing that is on my mind. The big thing that is on my mind is the inauguration. Wow. And in light of today's events, I can understand, why it's going to be interesting. The inauguration of Donald Trump is coming up, and we are having a party just a few blocks from the White House, a reception. So sign up and come join us at Hilton Garden Inn in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day. You can register at that link that I just dropped in the chat. Link is also down below. It's going to be a great event in Washington, D.C. It's going to be really spectacular. It's going to be a really, really great event. And I really look forward to seeing all of you there. It's going to be good music, good speeches, etc. I was working on my presentation today, actually. So it's going to be really great. The Center for Political Innovation is the organization that this channel is all about. Become a member of CPI, go to our website, become a member, get involved in our activities. We're always doing great things. We want a new America for working families. That is what we want. An America where the needs of working people come first. A government of action to fight for working families. That is what we want. That's all I've got for the moment in terms of announcements. First my opening remarks. Then from there, we will do a roll call. We'll find out who's watching, who's on the other side of the camera. And then from there, I will answer your questions for the remainder of the show. So if you got something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, send a Rumble rant. I see Hempcar has already sent 2. Send a super chat on YouTube, and I will give answers to those questions in the second half of our show. So think of questions to ask. I'll be taking note of them as they roll in throughout the show. Now, folks, it's interesting. My original plan was to just read the next chapter of my book tonight. And I'm still going to do that. But at the same time, the next chapter of this book that I just published, that Amazon is terrified of, we'll see what happens, but as of now, it's not on Amazon. This book that I just published, link is down below. It's on Lulu for sale. The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. It's coming true. I mean, the subtitle of this book is The Danger of an American Years of Lead. And what was the years of lead? Well, we'll be learning all about it when I read the chapter that I'm going to read today, chapter 2. That's where we left off from last night. The years of lead was a period of political violence and terrorism in Italy. It went on for 2 decades, from the 60s to the 80s. Italy was plagued with political violence. And I argue that the ruling class of the United States, the big monopolies and the corporations that run this country, are very afraid of the fact that Donald Trump got elected, appealing to anti-establishment, anti-NATO, anti-war sentiments, anti-FBI sentiments. And so they want to terrorize the American people out of politics. And so they are going to try and foment political violence and instability to scare people out of politics, to get people weary, and to get people to just kind of accept the things about life that they are not happy with. And that this is a strategy for managing dissent. As you create enough violence, you create enough confusion where the violence doesn't even make sense. Where is it coming from? And that kind of leads to people that want to get involved in the political process not getting involved. It leads to politics not making sense. It leads to people just kind of being weary and tired and ultimately accepting the status quo. And I look at what's happening right now, and it's like, holy shit. I mean, I wrote this book in response to the fact that a healthcare CEO got murdered, and mainstream media was basically making him a hero, and that social media exploded in a very, very manufactured way with celebration of him, and that worried me. But today, we're seeing, I mean, there was a shooting in Queens. There was a terrorist attack in Las Vegas. There was a terrorist attack in New Orleans. There was a hostage situation, it appeared, in Las Vegas. It's just incident after incident after incident is happening. And of course, they don't want you to see the details, right? They don't want you to pay attention to the facts. First of all, apparently, some of these killers made reference to ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Where did ISIS come from? Well, everybody knows that ISIS emerged from the terrorists that the American government was arming to fight against the Syrian government, the terrorists that actually successfully overthrew the Syrian government pretty recently. That's where ISIS came from. ISIS emerged from U.S.-backed forces, radical Islamists linked to al-Qaeda who were funded by the American government to overthrow the Syrian government, and those forces were just successful. And in fact, the current leader of Syria is a former al-Qaeda fighter himself. So, people look at this incidents with these people, driving their trucks and shooting people and all of that, and and they see ISIS involved, and it's like, would we be surprised that there would be an uptick in ISIS terrorist violence when ISIS, the very forces that ISIS emerged from, just seized control of Syria? Are we at all shocked by this? I'm not. And on top of that, I have seen some rather dumb things. First of all, people are saying the issue is immigration. Well, apparently, this ISIS guy was an American citizen, former U.S. military. That doesn't add up. The other thing is I have seen multiple places trying to link the pro-Palestine protests that are peaceful, that are legal, to these terrorist attacks. And I'm just like, how does that work? How does that work? You do know that ISIS and Israel are on the same side in almost every country in the Middle East. ISIS hates Iran and has carried out terrorist attacks against Iran. So does Israel. ISIS was formed from people fighting to overthrow the Syrian government, and so was Israel. In fact, Israel was caught giving medical aid and assistance to ISIS in their fight against the Syrian government. ISIS hates the Houthis in Yemen and has fought against them, considers them to be Shia apostates. Like, ISIS is on Israel's side everywhere. So when I see these dumb posts of like, oh, here's a terrorist attack by an ISIS guy, here's a terrorist attack, and here's a pro-Palestine rally, oh, they're all the same. It's like, no, they are not. They are not all the same. And, we're just supposed to assume, oh, yeah, they're a bunch of Muslims, they're against Israel. Well, it's not that simple, folks. And I get furious watching that when we know the main supporter of Islamic terrorism and ISIS-like organizations in the Middle East for decade after decade after decade has been the American government. And the main people fighting against ISIS have been the governments that the USA is trying to overthrow, like the government of Iran. Qasem Soleimani, the general of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, he killed more ISIS fighters than anybody. He was the top anti-ISIS fighter. He cut off the heads of ISIS fighters in Syria like you wouldn't believe. Bashar Assad, the Syrian government, that was a main target of ISIS. They were trying to overthrow it, right? Gaddafi, he tortured al-Qaeda types, and he was totally opposed to them. And ISIS recruited from the people who overthrew Gaddafi. In fact, the Manchester bomber who blew up the concert in Manchester, England, was an anti-Gaddafi fighter. He and his dad had gone to Libya to fight against Gaddafi, and then they went back to England and they blew up a concert and killed all kinds of innocent people. In Iraq, right? Everyone knows that in Iraq right now, the Shia majority is turning to Iran for protection. And the ISIS forces that hate Shia Muslims, they're fighting against Iran, and the U.S. government is carrying out strikes against Iranian-linked Shia militias in Iraq, and it just so happens that ISIS is also fighting against the Shia Muslims of Iraq. Everywhere you go in the world, ISIS is on the side of American imperialism. ISIS is on the side of Israel. So the idea that people marching with Palestine flags, as obnoxious as the pro-Palestine protesters can be, trust me, I know. And the thing is, I agree with them. I agree with their message. We Americans shouldn't be spending our money supporting Israel and its crimes. But the pro-Palestine protesters go out of their way to offend as many people. If they would just say what we at CPI have said over and over and over again, jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel, the Palestine protests would be wildly popular, because probably the bulk of Trump's supporters would agree with them. But the Palestine protesters can't do that because they have Trump derangement syndrome and they have woke brain, right? And so their message is that, oh, America's an evil, racist country, just like Israel. If you hate America, you should hate Israel too. Well, this is America, my friends. We don't hate America. We live here. And if you want to have a movement to oppose Israel in America, you should probably appeal to American people. But the Palestine movement is run by some very evil people like Brian Becker who want to make sure it fails. They are more concerned about grifting money from the Democrat Party and grifting money from George Soros and big foundations. They're far more concerned about that than actually stopping what Israel is doing. If Israel actually stopped its crimes against the Palestinians, they'd be out of business. They wouldn't be able to scam and hustle young college kids anymore. And so they have gone out of their way to not say what the very obvious message of the pro-Palestine movement should be, right? We walked around Portland, Oregon, a very woke city, last December with this banner: jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel. And we got, nothing but massive positive support for this message. People are ready for this, right? We had an American flag and a Palestine flag, and we went to college campuses, and we walked around downtown Portland, and people loved this message: jobs and schools for America, not weapons for Israel. But now, there's these ISIS terrorist attacks happening. And at the same time, there's Palestine protests. And the Palestine protests are so hateful towards average Americans that these Republicans are able to say, oh, look, the ISIS protests and the Palestine protests, the ISIS terrorism and the Palestine protests are the same thing. And people buy it. People in the MAGA can't buy it, which is just shocking to me. It's just frustrating to me to watch. But I am frustrated with the Palestine protesters because they should actually be trying to win over the American people, not just score woke points. But I'm also frustrated. I'm more frustrated by these dumb right-wingers that are trying to link ISIS, that is on Israel's side in Syria, on Israel's side in Iran, on Israel's side in Iraq, on Israel's side in Yemen, trying to link their attacks to the pro-Palestine movement. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's completely and utterly ridiculous. So that's just wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. So I'm frustrated by that. But I'll be honest with you all. I hate to get conspiratorial. I really do. I don't want to get tinfoil hatty, and I don't know. But the thesis of this book is that the American elite, the ruling class, are trying to foment a wave of political violence in response to Trump winning the election. And it looks to me like that is what is happening. I don't think that all these different terrorist attacks happening all at the same time is completely random. Okay? I don't think that. And I pay a lot of attention. I have a lot of respect for Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher who I have met with, who is the founder of the Eurasianist, or I guess he's the modern leader of the Eurasianist school of thought, the Eurasian International Movement. And Alexander Dugin, if you look at his Twitter page, he's saying this is to weaken Trump. This is to push Trump into being more pro-Israel. This is to weaken Donald Trump. And that's what it looks like to me. Tulsi Gabbard is going to be Trump's intelligence director if she makes it through Senate confirmation. And she was the one raising the alarm about how funding terrorism in Syria was going to backfire, and raising the alarm about how giving money to the people who eventually started ISIS and giving them Toyota trucks and giving them weapons and all of that was going to result in terrorist attacks. She's about to become the national director of intelligence. And it looks to me like, the policy of arming Islamic terrorists around the world is something that the Trump administration has been quite largely opposed to. You saw, I talked about last time Trump was in office, they talked about his Muslim ban. You remember they called it a Muslim ban. Well, it wasn't a Muslim ban, right? I mean, it wasn't a Muslim ban. They didn't ban Muslims from entering the country. There were 9 countries that they just stopped giving people visas in those 9 countries. And those were all countries that are in the middle of a conflict, that are in the middle of a conflict. And it's a conflict where the U.S. government is on one side, and there are other forces aligned with Iran on another side. And the way the American government is helping people is by giving them visas, rewarding them with visas. Well, those countries are the countries where Trump stopped the U.S. government from giving people visas. And they actually said, if you watched the Tucker Carlson show and all of that, and they basically said that there were people who had been allies of the United States, who had worked for the United States, who had risked their life for the United States, that weren't able to get rewarded with visas to come to the United States. Well, many of those people that are on the side of the United States, that risk their life for the United States, that support the United States, then get rewarded with visas. A lot of those people are tied in with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and, Wahhabi terrorist networks. And that's why, people like Tulsi Gabbard and certain people in the FBI and all that didn't want to continue this policy of giving them visas. And if you look at a lot of the recent terrorist attacks we've had in the United States, they've actually come from individuals who, were connected through their family or whatever to, U.S. fomenting of Islamic radicalism against countries that the U.S. government doesn't like. For example, the Tsarnaev brothers, they were Chechens, and the U.S. government for a long time has been supporting Islamic extremists in Chechnya to try and break Chechnya away from Russia. And the Tsarnaev brothers, their parents were Islamic extremists who had fought against Russia. And they had done such a good job, the American government gave them visas, and they came to the United States, and their kids ended up blowing up the Boston Marathon. And, the Pulse nightclub shooter, his dad was an Afghan guy who fought alongside Osama bin Laden and others in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and got rewarded with a visa, and he moved to the United States, and his kid shot up the Pulse nightclub. There's many examples of this, many examples of this. I told you the guy who bombed the Manchester concert was somebody who'd been armed by the British and American government to fight against Gaddafi in Libya. And then he came back and he blew up the Manchester concert in Britain. I believe the New Jersey bomber, he was somebody who'd fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, or his dad had fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And he came back and blew up some dumpsters and blew up some stuff in New Jersey, right? There's many examples of this. If you fund radical Al-Qaeda Wahhabi extremists, they're nuts, and they don't just, attack you. They don't just attack your enemy. They turn around and bite you, right? I mean, it's like it's one thing if you have a gun and you shoot somebody, but if you instead find the most crazy, bloodthirsty, rabid dog and unleash it in their house, and that's the way you're going to get them, there's a good chance that in the process, that dog might turn around and bite you. And that's been the American government policy, is rather than directly fighting the Soviet Union, rather than directly fighting Bashar Assad or the Syrian government, rather than directly fighting Gaddafi, rather than directly fighting Saddam Hussein, we find this bloodthirsty rabid dog, these Wahhabi extremists, the Osama bin Ladens and the Al-Qaeda, ISIS types, and we fund them, we give them training, we give them weapons, and then we unleash them on our enemy. And many times they have turned around and killed Americans. And what I want people to understand is that the American government, that's the problem, is they're not concerned about keeping us safe from terrorism. They're concerned about maintaining this international agenda, right? That's the issue, right? Is that they're more concerned with maintaining this global financial system than they are with, keeping Americans safe from terrorism. And that is something to be concerned about. So there you go. Now, on that note, I would like to just read to you all the second chapter of my new book, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. If you'd like to buy the book, it is currently on Lulu. I'm hoping that it's on Amazon again soon. very annoying situation, but I'm not ready to surrender yet. I think there's a good chance it'll be on Amazon soon, but we'll see what happens. But right now it's for sale on lulu.com. So I am going to read to you chapter 2 of my new book, and then I will answer any questions people have. We'll go from there. All righty. This is chapter 2 of my new book, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. There is a very naive assumption on the part of many people that the job of revolutionaries is simply to inspire people to be violent. The assumption is that if the passive majority were to just wake up, they would rise up and overthrow the system. This naive Hollywood understanding of revolution sees it as nothing more than an explosive release of pent-up rage at the status quo. In reality, revolution is a much more complex process. The engineers of successful revolutions knew this very well. The polemics of Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Kautsky, Kropotkin, and many other Marxist radicals in the early 20th century are full of terms like Thermidor, Brumaire, and Bonaparte, all of which are references to the events of the French Revolution of the late 18th century. For the European revolutionary intelligentsia, the struggles of Danton, Robespierre, and Jean-Paul Marat were an assumed point of reference. They viewed their movement as the intellectual and spiritual descendant of the French Revolution. In fact, their identification with the political label of left in opposition to rightists was rooted in the seating of the French National Assembly. Academic texts like The Anatomy of a Revolution by Crane Brinton, published in 1938, attempt to spell out these concepts in plain language for those whom the French Revolution is not as familiar as it was in those circles. Brinton's text explains a process that involves the old order fracturing, the elite fighting with each other, and unrest amassing at the bottom of society. From there, the new order begins to assert itself. The new order is made up of organizations among the discontented masses, as well as dissident factions of the old order. As the old order deteriorates and the new order becomes strong, this leads to a climactic moment. The old order breaks down amid a flood of social rage. The new order solidifies itself by restraining the excesses of the masses and suppressing the more chaos-oriented and radical elements who brought it to power. I'm actually going to pause the stream for one moment, just check on something. I do apologize. We're going to have to take a short break. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Just wanted to check and see what that was about. So we will continue reading. All is well, all is well. The bulk of the population, the sans-culottes in the French Revolution, are seen as a kind of easily swayed mass that the new order harnesses to take power, while the old order is constantly seeking to restrain them. The old order is conservative and wants the masses to obey leaders and follow social norms, respecting the existing hierarchy and hold in their anger and frustrations with life. The revolutionaries are the agitators who stir up the masses to greater confrontation and rebellion against the powers that be. The Bolshevik methods, as first proposed in Lenin's What Is to Be Done, published in 1903, are a refined and strategized version of this revolutionary orientation. The new order is centered around the vanguard party that functions as the tribune of the people. The vanguard party does not rely on the spontaneity of the masses, which will inevitably be absorbed back into the old system, but instead pushes them into confrontation with the system, working as a bellows to blow up a spark into a general conflagration. The revolutionary organization engages in agitation to the masses, stirring them up to a greater confrontation, while seeking out the best and brightest among the population and propagating to them, teaching them revolutionary ideology, and bringing them under the discipline of the revolutionary organization. For well over 100 years, those who oppose the Western imperialist system have been studying Lenin's writings, along with the further works of Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, and other radicals from the Marxist-Leninist tradition. While this is generally seen as an argument in favor of Marxist-Leninist tactics, it must be understood that for over 100 years, the imperialists have been studying these tactics and methods and working to counter them in the hopes of maintaining their system. An entire school of intelligence and military strategy known as counterinsurgency has been developed for the purpose of preventing events like the Russian, Chinese, Cuban, and Korean revolutions from occurring. The various counterinsurgency texts explaining the tactics of those assigned to defeat anti-colonial revolutions and train others in how to do so are publicly available, and they shed light onto how the present order can hold on to power in the face of mass opposition. One thing that is well known by both effective revolutionaries and effective counterinsurgency theorists is that a key aspect of a successful revolution is polarization. The Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917 because society was heavily polarized around the question of continuing involvement in World War I. The Bolsheviks had a massive organization leading labor unions and militias, and they were the largest and most effective entity opposed to continued involvement in the war. So, when this point of division in Russian society came to a head after the Tsar had abdicated in February, the Bolsheviks took power on a platform of peace, land, and bread, overthrowing the provisional government in October of 1917. In post-World War II China, Chiang Kai-shek became the symbol of the corrupt, intolerable status quo. Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army absorbed all who were frustrated and opposed to it. The key moment that secured Mao's victory was the crash of the Golden Yuan, Chiang's confiscation of all the gold of his wealthiest supporters, forcing them to accept a new paper currency in exchange for it, made him unpopular. When the Golden Yuan completely crashed and lost its value, at that point, even many of China's wealthiest people went over to Mao's United Front, utterly disgusted by the KMT's mismanagement and corruption. The defeat of France in Algeria and the defeat of the United States in Vietnam are similar stories. The old regime represented colonialism, poverty, corruption, and the disappointment and frustration that had built up for generations. The revolutionaries absorbed and gave voice to all the anger at the status quo and took power. Both British counterinsurgency strategist Frank Kitson and U.S. Cold War strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski reflected extensively on the fact that the profile of a revolutionary is a newly educated person. It is not the illiterate and impoverished peasant or factory worker who becomes Che Guevara or Mao Zedong. Rather, it is the middle-class person from a developing country who becomes educated and in the process becomes further enraged at how they come to understand the world around them to be. William S. Lind, the Pentagon strategist who oversaw U.S. operations in Iraq, has written extensively about fourth-generation warfare. One thing that comes across very clearly in their understanding of how to defeat an insurgency is that the light switch effect must be avoided at all costs. Explaining fourth-generation warfare, William S. Lind wrote, "The military historian Martin van Creveld compares a state military that, with its vast superiority and lethality, continually turns its firepower on a poorly equipped fourth-generation opponent to an adult who administers a prolonged, violent beating to a child in a public place. Regardless of how bad the child has been or how justified the beating might be, every observer sympathizes with the child. The power mismatch is so great that the adult's action is judged a crime. In the 3,000 years that the story of David and Goliath has been told, how many listeners have identified with Goliath?" Lind's fourth-generation warfare handbook gives the following analysis and diagnosis of the cause of insurgencies around the world. Quote, "At the heart of this phenomenon, fourth-generation war, lies not a military evolution, but a political, social, and moral revolution, a crisis of the legitimacy of the state. All over the world, citizens of states are transferring their primary allegiance away from the state to other entities, to tribes, ethnic groups, religions, gangs, ideologies, and causes. Many who are no longer willing to fight for their state will fight for their new primary loyalty." He then offers this prescribed solution. At the most powerful level of war, the moral level, the key to victory is to convince the local population to identify with the state, or at least acquiesce to it, rather than identifying with non-state entities. The goal of a counterinsurgency is to make the population identify with the state. In order to do this, it is necessary to make sure that whatever opposition exists is never solid enough of a force to command the loyalty of the population. The goal is to prevent any notion of what Lenin called dual power. The opposition must never present itself as a solid block or center of gravity. Frank Kitson made a point similar in his writing on what he called low-intensity warfare. Kitson argued that no society is ever totally at war or totally at peace, but rather there is a sliding scale. Kitson wrote, "If subversion fails to achieve the aim, it merges imperceptibly into insurrection, which at the end of the scale covers the activities of small sabotage or terrorist groups, but which spreads across the operational spectrum to include the activities of large groups of armed men. If these gangs become sufficiently numerous and well-armed to take on the forces of government in open combat on relatively even terms, insurgency merges into orthodox civil war, because at this stage, force has become the senior partner." He describes the need to suppress and isolate, quote, "subversives before they solidify enough to become terrorists, before they, and from there eventually escalate to the point of a full-scale civil war." Kitson was famous for his use of counter gangs to manipulate the opposition. He composed a book called Gangs and Counter-Gangs, describing how the British Empire defeated the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya. And I actually included photos. This is the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya and their fight against the British Empire. So I have a lot of photos in this book. I haven't really been showing the photos, but I'll show some of them as we go through. Right? The book describes capturing Mau Mau fighters and turning them into information gatherers and disinformation spreaders. The biography, Frank Kitson and the Untold Story of Counterinsurgency's Master Strategist by Ryland Hartwell, explains one of his key contributions was the concept of pseudo-gangs, a tactic that would later become synonymous with his name. Pseudo-gangs were small units composed of British soldiers and local Kyaku loyalists who disguised themselves as Mau Mau fighters. Operating behind enemy lines, these units infiltrated Mau Mau networks, gathered intelligence, and sowed distrust among the insurgents. Kitson believed turning Mau Mau's own tactics against them was essential for success. The pseudo-gang tactic proved effective in disrupting the insurgency, although it raised ethical questions that shadowed Kitson's legacy. While it is common for those who fancy themselves to be revolutionaries to study successful revolutions in order to understand the powers that be, how they've maintained their hold on, gotta read this paragraph again. While it is common for those who fancy themselves to be revolutionaries to study successful revolutions in order to understand the powers that be and how they have maintained their power and what methods they are likely to use, it is probably more important to study failed insurgencies. When we study failed insurgencies, the ones held up by the defenders of globalism, imperialism as successful models, we learn what techniques they are likely to use against us. So case study number 1, Northern Ireland. If one reads William S. Lynn's work on fourth generation warfare, one model of a successful counterinsurgency that he alludes to numerous times is the post-war troubles in Northern Ireland. It was Frank Kitson, the strategist who coined the phrases low-intensity warfare and counter-gangs, who largely oversaw the operations that led to the surrender of the Provisional Irish Republican Army with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Lind writes, by using overwhelming firepower at the tactical level, state forces may in some cases intimidate the local population into fearing them and leaving them alone. But fear and hate are closely related. And if the local population ends up hating state forces, that works towards their strategic defeat. This is why in Northern Ireland, British troops were not allowed to return fire unless they were actually taking casualties. The Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld argues that one reason that the British Army did not lose in Northern Ireland is that it accepted more casualties than it inflicted. Now, on the surface, this may appear to be true. The number of British soldiers directly killed by the Provisional Irish Republican Army is higher than the number of IRA fighters killed by the British military. But Lind is somewhat obscuring the nature of how the British Army was successful. An obituary for Frank Kitson lists his methods in Northern Ireland as the following: spreading black propaganda designed to undermine nationalists and Republicans, deploying psychological warfare techniques involving the torture of internees. From August of 1971 onwards, establishing the Military Reaction Force, a clandestine unit of the British Army that carried out unattributable assassinations of nationalists and Republicans on the streets of Belfast and other areas in the 6 counties, infiltrating unionist and loyalist organizations to form and control death squads, counter-gangs, in order to instigate and increase sectarian strife. Rather than having the British military directly fight the IRA, where the local population and the international community would inevitably side with the IRA as underdogs, Kitson arranged for funding and covert support for Protestant extremists. If the IRA fighters were killed by Protestants, this made the conflict appear much more to be a sectarian religious one rather than a national liberation struggle. Furthermore, if clandestine British Army forces assassinated IRA fighters quietly, it would be a lot harder for the local population to view it as a David and Goliath fight. As Lind explains, one key to the mafia's success is to conceal the use of force. If an individual needs to be whacked, then it is usually done with little fanfare and in the shadows. The rule is no fingerprints. Unless there is a specific message aimed for a larger audience, people who are killed by the mafia are seldom found. This method usually requires patience. It often takes a long time for the right moment to present itself. Throughout the 1980s, Northern Ireland and Britain became filled with various Marxist-Leninist, Trotskyite, and Maoist groups that opposed the IRA as revisionist. Even though the IRA was receiving Soviet and Libyan backing, various Marxist intellectuals declared it to somehow be contrary to genuine communist thought. During the same period, the IRA became somewhat adjacent to organized crime. Of course, this was exaggerated in the press. It was probably done to some degree in order to gain protection from rival organized crime groups that were being covertly pushed by the British to work against them in exchange for protection. Here I have a picture of the IRA, right? This is IRA fighters on patrol. With the IRA fighting Protestant loyalist fanatics, facing condemnation and often violence from other Irish nationalists and communists, while also increasingly getting mixed up with drug dealers and other socially undesirable entities, the conflict made less and less sense to the population. At the same time, the United Nations and various liberal NGOs funded peacemaking efforts to bring Catholics and Protestants together. Instead of the light switch effect, David versus Goliath, the troubles in Northern Ireland became a confusing mess. The loyalty of the population, which became weary of the violence, gradually went back over to the state. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, the IRA prisoners were released, and the bulk of the IRA laid down their arms and joined the government. A few dissident IRA groups still exist and conduct occasional attacks, but they have very little public support for their activities. The next case study, Operation Gladio. After the Second World War, the Communist Party of Italy was very popular. Its leaders had fought Hitler and Mussolini in the famous partisan brigades. The U.S. State Department in the mid-1960s assessed that the Italian Communist Party was not just the largest communist party in a non-communist country, but it was the largest political party in Western Europe, with over 1,350,000 active members. If the Italian Communist Party had won control of the parliament, this would have meant Italy leaving the NATO alliance. We now know that a special CIA program was created to prevent this from happening. It was called Operation Gladio. The CIA did everything possible to make sure that Italy never left the NATO alliance, and U.S. troops and military forces could remain in Italy to oppose the Soviet Union. The results of Operation Gladio were what was known in Italy as the Years of Lead. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Italy was plagued with political violence. The Italian Communist Party did not advocate violence. In fact, Mao Zedong had condemned the Italian Communist Party as revisionist, publishing a pamphlet called the differences between Comrade Tagliati and us. The Italian Communist Party was committed to winning elections peacefully and legally, and moving to implement socialism through a coalition government in alliance with Social Democrats, peace activists, and labor unionists. The Italian Communist Party was Soviet-aligned and Soviet-funded, no doubt, and it wanted to transition Italy to leave NATO and align with the Soviet Union, but it was not an advocate of violent revolution. In order to facilitate Operation Gladio, the CIA set up the P2 Masonic Lodge, a fraternal organization that many Italian politicians, businessmen, and Catholic clergymen were involved with. The P2 Masonic Lodge worked to facilitate the assassination of Communist Party leaders. The Italian Social Movement, a group of Italians who admired Mussolini, was formed. Various armed far-right groups, such as the Armed Revolutionary Nuclei, were formed to begin killing communists. When the political crisis escalated in 1968, violence between communists and fascists intensified. Starting in the early 1970s, the Red Brigades emerged. These were young Italian communists who felt the Communist Party was revisionist and began engaging in assassinations and bombings. I have a picture of Red Brigade graffiti. There's like graffiti for the Brigate Rosse, Red Brigades. The Red Brigades were led by various dissident communist factions, such as the Communist Combat Party or the Union of Combatant Communists. The Red Brigades targeted business owners, first taking them hostage to support striking workers, often humiliating them and displaying them with degrading signs in the style of China's Cultural Revolution. They also assassinated members of the Italian social movement and other fascist groups, as well as retaliating against judges who would send their members to prison. Soon the Red Brigades began killing leaders of the Italian Communist Party, who they believed to be cooperating with the police. The Italian Communist Party leaders tried to downplay the rivalry with the Red Brigades, calling them comrades who do wrong, but it did not help. In 1978, the Italian Communist Party received a very large percentage of the vote. The Christian Democratic Party, led by Aldo Moro, a former prime minister, announced that it was in the process of making a historic deal and forming a coalition government with the communists. The Red Brigades thought the Italian communists joining a coalition government was a betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles. The United States feared this coalition government would result in Italy leaving NATO. The Red Brigades then kidnapped and murdered Aldo Moro, and the proposed alliance didn't happen, and the Italian Communist Party never became part of the ruling coalition. Journalist Carmine Pecorelli publicly blamed the kidnapping of Aldo Moro on the CIA and Operation Gladio, and hinted that some kind of secret society was being used to keep Italy in NATO. He leaked a number of letters that Moro had written to his family and revealed that during his interrogations by the Red Brigades, Moro had told his captors it was obvious that they were being used by the CIA to block the coalition government. Pecorelli wrote that Italian government officials knew where Moro was being held, but refused to rescue him because they didn't get permission from something called Christ's Lodge in Paradise. Pecorelli was then assassinated himself, with the police suspecting the killers were part of a far-right organization, though this could never be proven. Hundreds of Red Brigade fighters who did not want to go to prison fled to France, where the French government, part of NATO, offered them sanctuary. French President François Mitterrand stated that Italian Red Brigade terrorists were welcome to live in France as long as they, quote, have broken links with the infernal machine in which they participated and have begun a second phase of their lives and have integrated into French society. Over 428 people were killed in Italy's years of lead, though hundreds more were injured. One of the most common tactics employed by the fascists and the Red Brigades was to shoot someone in their legs and cripple them for life, a tradition rooted in the mafia's infamous practice of kneecapping people. In 1981, the existence of the P2 Masonic Lodge and a list of members was revealed. The list included some of Italy's top political leaders, including even a few communists. The organization had been widely rumored to exist among those involved in Italian politics. The Italian Communist Party officially cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1978, becoming Euro-communist. A number of factors led to this. One factor was the increasing influence of academia among communist circles. Funding for college professors to write about Marxism and cooperation between Italian Marxist academics and French intellectuals like Louis Althusser and Jean-Paul Sartre nudged many Italian communists to have a less pro-Soviet view. American intellectual Joseph Buttigieg, the father of Pete Buttigieg, translated the prison notebooks of communist leader Antonio Gramsci and founded the International Gramsci Society, emphasizing a more cultural and less economic interpretation of Marxism. This came at the same time the CIA was covertly funding other European Marxist academics like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, associated with the Frankfurt School, promoting their work in CIA-funded magazines like Der Monat, Paris Review, Partisan Review, and Encounter. With a rising influence from academia, discourse among Italian communists increasingly became more postmodern and anti-Soviet, equating the Soviet Union with totalitarianism in New Left thinking. In addition to increasingly liberal and postmodern tone of Italian communist discourse, the Italian Communist Party also became terrified of Red Brigade terrorism. Elected officials from the Communist Party increasingly became reliant on Italian security services for protection from the Red Brigade terrorism. In 1989, the Italian Communist Party embraced color revolutions taking place across Eastern Europe and called for dissolving the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Italian Communist Party officially liquidated. The bulk of the organization formed a new party called the Democratic Party of the Left that was pro-NATO and aligned with the British Labour Party. A smaller, more radical group called the Communist Refoundation Party was established, made up of a variety of Trotskyites, Maoists, and others who wanted to hold on to the more radical stances associated with communism. In short, after a prolonged period of political violence that became more and more confusing, imperialism, globalism was victorious. The population became more and more weary of the violence. The main anti-NATO entity, the Communist Party, was weakened politically and ultimately collapsed. Italians left the country in big numbers during the years of lead, though migration to the United States decreased when politics became more stable during the late 80s. Much like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Italy's resistance to imperialism was pacified by making sure no light switch effect was created, making the resistance and opposition a confused mess and making the population weary of sectarian violence. The existing state tied to NATO and globalism imperialism won by default. Case study number 3, Jamaica. Jamaica in the 1970s and 80s is a similar story. Jamaica was a former British colony and part of the Western imperialist financial system in the Caribbean. The island was plagued by poverty and instability, but in the atmosphere of the post-World War II wave of anti-colonial struggles, the People's National Party came to power. Prime Minister Michael Manley took office in 1972, and 2 years later declared himself to be an admirer of Fidel Castro and announced his goal of moving Jamaica toward democratic socialism and an alliance with the Soviet Union. One of Manley's primary advisors was Donald Harris, the father of U.S. presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Here's a photograph of Michael Manley with Fidel Castro. That was the elected president, prime minister, the elected head of state, prime minister of Jamaica, who aligned with the Soviet Union and admired Fidel Castro and was trying to move Jamaica towards socialism and anti-imperialism. The drug trade had long plagued Jamaica, and the drug gangs took sides as the People's National Party, anti-imperialist and pro-Soviet, and the Jamaican Labor Party, pro-British and backed by imperialism, globalism, battled for power. Violence escalated throughout the 70s. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency was involved in supplying guns and weapons and infiltrating criminal organizations. 844 people were murdered in political violence that preceded the 1980 election. It is now a matter of public record that the infamous Shower Posse gang was provided with weapons and training by the CIA as it launched a wave of assassinations and bombings intended to support the Jamaican Labor Party. Throughout the 70s and 80s, people fled the island in large numbers to avoid the violence, migrating to the United States. The Shower Posse set up shop in the United States and got involved in operations against various criminal organizations with a black nationalist orientation, some of whom were accused of being funded by Gaddafi and the Soviet Union. In August of 1985, Jamaican families who attended a community gathering in Oakland, New Jersey, found themselves surrounded by gunfire. The crowd of over 2,000 people ran and ducked in panic as criminal organizations associated with the Jamaican Labor Party fought with criminal organizations associated with the People's National Party. 3 people were killed and 9 were wounded. In a parallel to Northern Ireland, at the same time that the U.S. government was funding armed groups and the political struggle deteriorated into gang warfare, big record companies, the United Nations, and many liberal organizations were promoting a message of peace and reconciliation. In April of 1978, Bob Marley joined hands with the leaders of both parties at the widely memorialized One Love concert, which was a plea to end the killing. And here we have, this is people in Jamaica ducking to avoid the gunfire. And this is the famous One Love concert where the leader of the Labor Party and Michael Manley of the People's National Party joined hands. Can't we all just get along? Peace and love. At the same time, the U.S. government was funding gangs to murder people on the streets. They also had this bland, can't we all just get along? Peace and love message. It was very strategic. Same thing they did in Northern Ireland. As the Soviet Union declined, the People's National Party became less and less anti-imperialist, and today functions as a neoliberal social democratic party. The Shower Posse and other criminal organizations, quote, non-state actors, continue to be a plague on Jamaica. In 2010, drug dealer Christopher Koch, a leader of the Shower Posse organization, waged a battle with Jamaican authorities in the hopes of avoiding extradition to the United States. On May 24th and 25th, gang members burned 2 police stations. 73 civilians were killed, along with 4 law enforcement and military personnel. Koch was eventually arrested in June and extradited to the United States, where he was sentenced to 23 years in prison for drug trafficking. Yeah, the big gangster in Jamaica was trained by the CIA, but eventually the USA extradited him and took him to prison. Frank Kitson is infamously quoted as saying, "If a fish has got to be destroyed, it can be attacked directly by rod or net. But if a rod and net cannot succeed, it is necessary to do something with the water." And his quotation is probably intended to be a nod to Mao Zedong's famous quote about guerrilla warfare. The masses are the water, and the revolutionaries are the fish. Kitson's thinking is that to completely poison the atmosphere surrounding insurgents, so they have nowhere to swim and cannot get popular support. In all three of the conflicts above, in which the British and pro-NATO forces worked to prevent a country from breaking out of their grip, this was done. A mass anti-imperialist movement that was winning and had a base among the population was derailed by escalating a wave of confusing, theatrical, and brutal violence. Politics became too dangerous to participate in for fear of one's own safety. Politics also became extremely confusing, with groups with roughly the same stated goals and beliefs killing each other, with criminal organizations playing an increasing role, and lots of confusion all around. In all of these conflicts, the British and the Americans concealed their hand and did not directly attack their enemies, not wanting to create a David and Goliath scenario. Lind writes, given the mismatch between occupying troops and the local armed elements, any fighting works to the occupier's disadvantage on the all-important moral level. In addition, the societal disorder the fighting inevitably creates works to the advantage of non-state elements. In all of these situations, the quiet handing out of money and assistance to the population and manipulating various non-state actors was key. As Lind writes, what artillery and air power are in third-generation war, cash is in fourth-generation war. The infantry is most useful supporting arm. Local commanders must have a bottomless slush fund of cash. Obviously, this cash cannot be subjected to normal accounting procedures, as most will necessarily and properly be used for bribes. It is imperative that any regulations or bureaucratic obstacles to bribery are promptly changed. Furthermore, it was key to sow distrust among the various insurgent factions and play up ethnic, religious, and tribal and regional differences. Lind's handbook also writes, distinguish between captured opponents on the basis of motivation, tribe, religion, or some other basis that the local people will recognize. Treat some as honored guests and send them home while continuing to detain others. This causes suspicion and division among the opponents. These methods of preventing an anti-imperialist government from emerging and isolating and weakening an anti-imperialist movement have a pretty negative effect on a country overall. Northern Ireland, Jamaica, and Italy both experienced waves of people simply leaving to avoid the violence. All three countries experienced an overall economic deterioration due to the conflict and societal fracturing as well. Jamaica never recovered from the escalation of gang warfare in the 1970s and continues to have gang violence of a far less political nature right up to today. Many countries in Central America have a similar problem with drug gangs, narcos, most of which trace their roots back to the same era when the United States was training drug-dealing Contras to fight against communism throughout the region. The reason that all of this is relevant in a book about the 2024 murder of Brian Thompson in New York City is that these methods of counterinsurgency are obviously being utilized in the United States at this time. The forces waging the counterinsurgency in the United States are the same as those in Ireland, Jamaica, and Italy. It is the global financial system headquartered in Wall Street and London, the economic form of the British Empire, and more specifically, its military bloc, NATO, that rules the United States and is seeking to maintain control. Frank Kitson describes insurgency as three stages: subversion, terrorism, and civil war. In Kitson's understanding, if there is widespread distrust and contempt for the state, this will then lead to the emergence of organizations that work against the state. He considers this to be terrorism. If this terrorism, quote, proliferates, the result will be the state itself fracturing between sections aligned with the existing order and another side that aligns with the, quote, terrorists. This is civil war. Kitson's use of the word terrorism is quite different from the definition used by Marxists and even by most people who use the term. He considers organizations that have a mass base among the population and organize mass strikes, protests, and rebellions to demand progressive reforms to be terrorists because they are seeking to change the system, quote, by force. Regardless, Kitson's 3 stages of insurgency match Mao Zedong's 3 stages: strategic defensive, strategic equilibrium, and strategic offensive. At one point in an insurgency, the enemies of the status quo are simply engaged in public protest and spreading their ideas. What Mao Zedong called strategic defensive, Kitson calls subversion. At some point, territory is seized, mass organizations are built, alliances are made with sections of the power structure, and the revolutionary organization flourishes. This is what is called terrorism by Frank Kitson because the revolutionary organization has power and is able to exercise it. Mao Zedong labeled this phase strategic equilibrium. Then the existing state cracks, with one side aligned with the revolutionary forces and the other side opposing them. This is what is called civil war by Frank Kitson and what Mao Zedong called strategic offensive. This is the period of the struggle in which the revolutionary organization is capable of taking power. Kitson argued that all societies are constantly existing somewhere on this scale of insurgency. In terms of Kitson's analysis, U.S. society is experiencing widespread subversion. The counterinsurgency is being waged against a very confused but increasingly angry U.S. population that opposes U.S. foreign policy, is angry with the economic deterioration of the country, and feels its freedoms are being eroded. The greatest fear is that some kind of solid block of opposition could emerge and form organizations with roots among the masses and begin to force changes and exercise power. This is what Frank Kitson calls terrorism and what Mao Zedong called strategic equilibrium. The closest thing to a solid block of opposition to NATO and the overall agenda of globalism and imperialism is Donald Trump, a politician who has been successful by giving voice to much of the outrage about these issues. John Bolton, who previously served as Trump's national security advisor, warned that the USA would pull out of NATO if Trump were to take office again. Trump's first term in office was very much in line with NATO's foreign policy goals and didn't stray very much from the status quo. Trump does seem to cater more to those with sentiments that the ruling order considers to be subversive. So this is why they do not trust him. Beneath the surface, across the United States, anti-establishment ideas are growing more popular. Libertarianism, socialism, Marxism, and a whole slew of different anti-establishment conceptions that are labeled conspiracy theories and all kinds of dissident ideas have widespread interest and support among the discontented population. The first sign that U.S. politics was shifting out of the control of the powers that be was the rise of Bernie Sanders in 2016 and the subsequent outrage at the Democrat convention in July. Sanders, long a fringe element among the Democrats, rose to be a front runner with his message of democratic socialism, calling for healthcare and education to be provided to the public free of charge. Though Sanders accepted defeat and endorsed Hillary Clinton, his supporters did not. Leaked emails showing how the Democratic Party had been internally manipulated in order to weaken Sanders intensified the outrage. The second sign that U.S. politics was out of control came in November of 2016 when Trump won the election despite mainstream media opposition that Trump would lose. and predictions that Trump would lose. Trump won because the establishment seemed to be against him. Many Bernie Trump voters openly said they would have voted for Sanders if he had been the nominee, but picked Trump as he seemed more anti-establishment than Hillary Clinton. Trump's first term ended with pandemic lockdowns, widespread distrust of government mask and vaccine mandates, a wave of rioting among African Americans in opposition to police brutality, and then a riot in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, 2021, just before Trump left office. The anti-establishment sentiments that made Sanders popular and propelled Trump to win 2 elections are very much alive. The public still opposes the foreign policy, the economic deterioration, and the emerging low-wage police state. However, the counterinsurgency is in full swing and is functioning somewhat effectively and making sure that no solid opposition emerges. The counterinsurgency at this time functions as a mechanism for containing and channeling the rising anger and dissent of the population into ineffective channels and into areas deemed useful and safe by different sections of the power structure. For example, the rise of Bernie Sanders and the wave of interest in socialism among young people has been effectively channeled into a mere defense of the establishment. This was done using a wave of social media influencers called BreadTube. Various unheard of young commentators exploded into popularity across social media as the voices of socialism, boosted by mainstream media and the algorithms. They were trained by U.S. intelligence-connected deprogrammer and admitted former kidnapper Steve Hassan. Abigail Thorne, Philosophy Tube was funded by both British intelligence and George Soros. Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, was even celebrated by Hillary and Chelsea Clinton. They all promoted a socialism that was in line with U.S. foreign policy goals and did not even present economic demands. They focused the bulk of their programming not even on advocating their vague worker cooperative or welfare state understanding of socialism, but on pounding the podium against fascism of Donald Trump and the supposed evil of tankies and Nazbols, i.e., leftists who didn't support NATO and wanted to change the prevailing order. None of these voices were connected to any existing socialist or Marxist organization, except a vague connection with Democratic Socialists of America. They all took aim at any leftist voice who spoke out of turn, most especially at Jimmy Dore's call to force the vote for Medicare for all during the pandemic. Trump's campaign became just as confused by online manipulation. QAnon became popular with the belief that rather than demanding anything from the administration, his supporters should, quote, trust the plan. Trump was said to be waging some kind of shadow war with a secret cabal of pedophiles. This all led to a riot in which at least 26 FBI assets enabled protesters to enter the U.S. Capitol building. The result was a huge crackdown of many of the most radical Trump supporters, including leaders of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, being sent to federal prison, and widespread confusion among Trump supporters. All of William S. Lind and Frank Kitzen's tactics are being employed. Lind wrote about how cash was useful in fourth-generation warfare. Modern technology has taken this to another level. With Patreon and other social media platforms, funds can be handed out to incentivize behavior with their sources being completely concealed. The top voices among the dissident communities, be they leftists, right-wing, libertarian, or conspiracy-oriented, are all receiving hefty monthly payouts and constantly adjusting their behavior to please the anonymous donors and any demands that they make. Events like the 2023 Rage Against the War Machine rally, in which a coalition of sorts to oppose U.S. foreign policy seemed to be in the works, were immediately condemned by the top voices in all dissident spaces. Every difference, every rumor, and every suspicion among the participants was amplified to make sure the event was as small as possible, and as a result, the coalition did not last. The main focus of the events of the establishment in their counterinsurgency is on keeping subversion as merely an online hobby or fandom. All the primary voices in right-wing, libertarian, and leftist spaces insist on that and immediately line up to condemn and marginalize all real organizing or coalition building. If a solid opposition movement emerges, this could lead to a light switch effect. In our current atmosphere of distrust for the establishment, it would be perceived as a David versus Goliath scenario. As Frank Kitson warned, this subversion could soon lead to what he would deem to be terrorism, which could eventually lead to an all-out civil war against the power structure, which would never allow the country to transition out of globalism, imperialism in a peaceful way. While the counterinsurgency seems to be effective, Donald Trump still won the 2024 election by playing into subversive talking points. Public opinion is still very unhappy with the status quo. The U.S. state itself is highly disunited in how to respond to the crisis, with very solid disagreements about Ukraine, the partisan role of the FBI, Israel, and tech censorship and information control. The real fear of the powers that be is that openings created by divisions among the elite and widespread anti-establishment sentiments could manifest themselves in some kind of opposition movement with real roots among the masses. The election of Donald Trump signifies that the counterinsurgency in its current mode is insufficient. The reason the Uhuru movement was raided by the FBI in 2022, indicted and subjected to a 2-year-long legal process in federal court, is that among all this, quote, subversive forces in the United States, they have the largest mass base and influence. With their community service programs as part of their Black Power blueprint, there are hundreds of thousands of African Americans in Missouri and Florida who come into direct contact with this anti-imperialist Black revolutionary organization. If the Uhuru movement simply had a YouTube channel, they would pose no threat. They were singled out by the U.S. government because they represent the beginning of the next stage of, quote, insurgency, with a base among the population and organizations providing services to the population. The killing of Brian Thompson and its celebration across social media represents the dangerous next stage in the counterinsurgency. To prevent something like the Jamaican People's National Party, the Italian Communist Party, or the Provisional IRA, solid forces of opposition to global imperialism with a real base among the population, from emerging, the counterinsurgency is escalating toward a preemptive American years of lead. The manipulation of dissident circles through social media has been massive. A bitter, competitive atmosphere has been created. It has already become the case that if you disagree with someone, often someone who is closer to you ideologically, but somehow wrong, it is necessary to get them fired from their job, destroy their reputation online, and force all their friends to denounce them. BreadTube successfully diverted the various socialists from building a movement for socialism to instead canceling ordinary working people for being racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic. Often the primary target of BreadTube cancel campaigns was not simply ordinary people with right-wing views, but rather other socialists deemed to be crypto-fascists or TERFs. Libertarians spend far more time tearing down Angela McArdle, chair of the Libertarian Party, for her alleged heresy against the ideology than they do defending their own beliefs. Libertarian spaces online are dominated by various influencers who work overtime to prevent any real organizing or coalition building and focus on tearing each other down. What Sigmund Freud wrote about, the narcissism of small differences, has taken on an extreme character, where dissident circles have been effectively manipulated into being circular firing squads. The establishment itself selects who in the dissident communities gets to have the upper hand by arranging them for them to dominate social media. The selected influencers of dissident spaces take aim at various other figures within their own ideological community, most especially anyone attempting to build any real coalition or real-life activism. Dissident activity is reduced to becoming a kind of internet entertainment, with beefs, disagreements, and tea, gossip, defining conversations that become less and less about principles and more about individual loyalties and personalities. Peter Coffin has spoken extensively about fandom as the toxic reality of dissident politics in our time. But even with all of this, the dissident feelings continue. So the next stage is to bring the circular firing squad into real life, escalate to violence, and get the dissidents to start shooting, kidnapping, and bombing, poisoning the water by making it extremely violent and dangerous. Make dissident politics a space of both physical and legal danger. Most people will want to avoid getting shot or arrested and will completely avoid dissident circles. The hope is that the population will get weary of the violence and gradually de-radicalize and just accept the deteriorating conditions and injustices. As no solid opposition or movement even exists, if violence becomes a solidified trend among dissidents, it will almost immediately escalate to dissidents killing each other, just as the Red Brigades deteriorated from killing and kidnapping factory owners to murdering other communists. The dissident communities are already ideologically diverse. The game plan seems to be an enhanced version of what went on during Trump's first 4 years with Charlottesville, January 6th, Force the Vote, Black Lives Matter, etc. Trump's presidency is to be tainted by instability and unrest, and dissident spaces that believe in subversive ideas are to become increasingly toxic and physically unsafe to get involved with. The population is to become more and more weary as a result and elect a pro-NATO candidate in 2028 and become less involved in dissident spaces. In December of 2024, Luigi Mangione is being shown on television almost constantly. A documentary film about his life has been announced. Celebration of him as a hero for murdering a corporate executive in complete isolation as an act of vengeance is being blasted at full volume across social media. When Christopher Dorner went on his killing spree against police officers in 2013, Facebook shut down groups praising him and worked hard to suppress outright celebration of his killings. But in 2024, a decade later, praise for a man believed to have killed a corporate executive for political reasons is being amplified. This is being done to push dissident circles in the United States on the same path that dissidents in Northern Ireland, Italy, and Jamaica were pushed on. It is a path that will lead to a weary and traumatized population and an isolated, fractured, violent, vengeful dissident community that gradually loses influence over time. Those of us who want to rescue the United States from the unfolding nightmare of decaying globalism imperialism must think strategically. We must not play into a counterinsurgency strategy that will ultimately benefit our enemies. This is why the murder of Brian Thompson should not be celebrated. And that was chapter 2 of my book, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. So we're about halfway through the book now. There's still the final chapter 3 and the conclusion and the appendices left in the book. But this is my book. My book that Amazon will not put up at the moment. We'll see what happens. But that's my book. You can order it down below. It's on Lulu. I'm hoping it'll be back up on Amazon soon. I hope that you will read it. I hope you will take to heart what it says, because the idea that we should be celebrating the murder of Brian Thompson, that we should be escalating to violence, that's wrong, right? And that I believe that the political violence that's happening, I mean, I saw what was happening with Luigi Mangione, and I said, this smells really bad to me. Now I see the wave of violence all over the country that's happened just today and yesterday. I can tell you, like I said, they are trying to taint Trump's presidency with violence. They're trying to make dissident spaces unsafe. I can see exactly what is going on here. So that is what I wrote about. I'm always ahead of the game, right? And I said they're trying to taint Trump's presidency with violence. Look what happened, right? Trump hasn't even taken the oath, and there's violence happening. I mean, I'm telling you, I know what's going on, right? I have connections, and I know stuff, and I understand how the deep state operates, and I pay close attention to these trends, and I've studied revolutionary movements in history. I know what's going on, and that's why I'm here, is to pass on this knowledge to you and to utilize this knowledge so we can build a real serious movement to rescue our country. We're not interested in dressing up and pretending that we're communists. We don't have a Politburo. We're not being silly. We are trying to save our country from the nightmare of the emerging low-wage police state by breaking it out of this decaying system of capitalism, imperialism, globalism, and building a new society, a government of action that fights for working families. So on that note, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you, and then we'll start answering questions. So who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? We got Connor in Colorado, Lawrence Johnson in Chicago, Hempcar Jacob in Wisconsin, St. David's, Bermuda, Ian Chester in England, Doug in Santa Barbara, California. Welcome, Doug. Good to have you with us. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. JDL from Missouri, JT24 from Mississippi, Patch in Arizona, Courtney in Virginia, Ryan in Kansas City, Kay in New Orleans, Rice from Adelaide, Australia. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Gabby in Chicago, Scott in Maryland, Master Jack in South Africa, Brooklyn in the house. Deep state is really out of control. I agree. John McCarthy in Chicago. Great work, John. Good morning from Denmark, says Sami. Very, very good. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Anybody else? Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Deborah in Sydney, Australia. Aguilar in Colorado. Penny in Minnesota. Good to talk to you. Good to see you. Twilly, willy, wit, boom, boom. Right? There's an old German folk song. They call me Dr. Ironbeard. Twilly, willy, wit, boom, boom. I come to town just once a year. Twilly, willy, wit, boom, boom. And apparently it was about back in the day, in like the 1700s, when doctors were a new thing. There was actually a doctor who toured. He went around performing surgery as a show. And he had like dancing girls, and he would perform surgery with like crowds of people watching him. And that was apparently a real thing. There was this doctor who made being a surgeon, a doctor, a performance. And so that was like in the 1700s when doctors were kind of a new thing. And so they wrote this like kind of children's song about him. And the song kind of hints that he's a con man. He's a swindler. Like the one of the verses is like, for I can make the lame to see, the blind to walk, and Yeah, basically it's like everything wrong. Like he makes the lame to see, the blind to walk, and the deaf to see or something. I don't remember, but anyway, it's like you know, the idea is that he's kind of a con man, and it's, you know, the image in the song is of like a traveling medicine salesman, a snake oil salesman, right? That's kind of what the song is about. But apparently that guy, the German guy who the German folk song is about, was not a con man. He was just a surgeon who, you know, was performed surgery, which was a very, you know, something that was rarely done back in the day, and he just, you know, would do it before a live audience. You know, but anyway, that's a whole nother story. But it's one of those, you know, traditional German melodies, and I love melodies, right? Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Right? Maybe I can find a recording, but it's just one of those German melodies that I like. Strong melodies. Guilty as charged. I like strong melodies. That is one thing that I like. I was sitting in church on a couple Sundays ago before Christmas, and they sang "What Child Is This?" And I know "What Child Is This?" because that's Greensleeves, right? That's the classic English song Greensleeves. And I guess the story is that it was during the reign of King Henry VIII that the song Greensleeves, this old English love song, became popular. And it was so popular among the English people that they wanted to keep singing it during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. But Oliver Cromwell was a religious fanatic, and he would not allow people to sing love songs because they were not religious. They were not Christian. So they rewrote the lyrics to Greensleeves to make it about Jesus. And that's the song, "What Child Is This?" And so I was sitting in church and someone got up and sang, "What child is this?" And I started smiling because I know the whole story. That's actually Greensleeves. You know, so yeah, maybe we'll play Greensleeves, right? This is was like the most popular song during the reign of King Henry VIII. There's actually rumors that King Henry VIII himself wrote it. I don't, you know, that's not true. He didn't write it. It was just a really, really popular song in England in the 16th century. And it's called Greensleeves. And I have always enjoyed it. And it's a very soothing, peaceful melody. It's a strong melody. And you all know I love a strong melody. That's my taste in music. I love strong melodies. When it comes to Mozart, I love Rondo alla Turca because it is a strong melody. I like strong melodies. So let me find a Greensleeves that I can play for you, right? Because I like Greensleeves. It is one of the most classic old English melodies. And I'm going to find a version of Greensleeves that I can play for you on this stream because I love Greensleeves. I really do. I love Greensleeves. Right? It's good shit. Let me find a version. Preferably a version where someone is singing the original lyrics. Yeah, let me find it. I'm just scrolling the internet to find a version of Greensleeves that I can get away with playing on here. And I think I found one. All right. This is an a cappella version of a guy singing Greensleeves, the classic English love song that was transformed into a religious song, a religious Christmas song, so they could keep singing the melody because they just loved the melody so much. And so let me just pull it down for you all, and we will listen to Greensleeves. If you all have any questions, by all means, you know, please send your questions. You know, I have some Rumble rants to answer. I don't have any super chats as of yet. So if you have any super chats, by all means, send them in, and I will answer them. So send in any questions that you've got. Last night, y'all did a great job, and I answered a lot of questions. We're going to listen to the classic, one of my favorite old English melodies, Greensleeves. Greensleeves. right? This is Green Sleeves.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously, and I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight, green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady Green Sleeves? I have been ready at your hand to grant whatever you crave. I have both rage at life and hand, your love and gold with thought to have. Green sleeves was all my joy.
We can do better than that. He's not very good. No offense, fella. You're just not very good. I'm going to put on this other version of Green Sleeves. That wasn't the best. All right, here, we'll do a better version.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously, and I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight, green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady Green Sleeves? I have been ready at your hand to grant whatever you would crave. I have both waged life and land, your love and goodwill for to have. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight, green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady Green Sleeves? Well, I will pray to God on high that though my cause and sin may see, and that yet was before I died, thou wilt vouchsafe to love me. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight, green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but my lady
Yeah, now that's Green Sleeves. That is the old English melody, one of the oldest songs in the English language, Green Sleeves. And I love that melody. And so there you go. I am a sucker for a strong melody. Guilty as charged. I love me a strong melody. I will say my taste in music is about as white as you can get. I am the whitest white music white guy ever. I do appreciate a lot of African American music. I appreciate a lot of Asian music and all of that, but my parents took me to folk music concerts when I was a kid, and I learned to appreciate old English ballads. And my music tastes are whiter than sour cream. And that's just the reality of it. And I don't think people should be forced to, have this music. And I think we should celebrate music from other cultures. I am all about that. And I will say that a lot of what we think of as white music is not. For example, country music is black in origin, right? Where do you think? Look up hoedown. Where do hoedowns come from? They don't come from from white people, right? The term hoedown was originally an African American term. Country music is black in its origin. We think of it as white, but it is very, very black. Black people invented country music. So, I will admit though that I do, my love for strong melodies, that is particularly European, right? That's one aspect of white music, is white music tends to have those very strong melodies, and it doesn't have a more steady beat, right? But who knows? I had a friend in college, and his uncle didn't believe in listening to rock and roll music because he said that rock and roll music was satanic, which many fundamentalist Christians believe. Not so much anymore, right? But like if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, that was a very common belief among fundamental Baptists, among others, that rock and roll music was inherently devil worship. Fundamentalist religious people in America don't believe that anymore because there's so much fundamentalist Christian rock, right? But, if you go to Bob Jones University, which is a fundamental Baptist college, many of the people there will tell you that Christian rock and roll is an oxymoron, right? That there is no such thing as Christian rock and roll because rock and roll is inherently satanic. And so my friend was arguing with his uncle, who believed that rock and roll music was inherently satanic. And he actually had a pamphlet about this. And in the pamphlet, it had a picture of an ancient African tribe. And this African tribe, like beating on drums. And it says, African tribes play rock and roll music as they worship Satan. I thought that was particularly funny. I really doubt that, that African tribe that was playing drum, I don't think they were playing rock and roll music, and I really doubt they were worshiping Satan. But regardless, but the argument was that any steady beat in music, that steady drum beat, is sexual. It's sexually arousing, and it imitates the sex act. And it reminds you of having sex in a subconscious way, and it makes you sexually aroused. And that was the argument that was used at the time of Elvis Presley in the 1950s, when rock and roll music was first being widely popularized. Many people did argue that rock and roll music was pornography, that it was a steady drum beat that reminded you of sex, right? It reminded you of the sex act. What's interesting is that actually rock and roll music, though, it comes from Pentecostal religious prayer music. Actually, it comes from the Pentecostal prayer traditions, right, that they would do, which comes from the Black church, and that's kind of interesting. And so there is kind of an African root to it, but it comes from Christian music. I mean, rock and roll music, its roots are largely Christian, black and Christian, I guess I'll say. It is African American Christianity is probably the root of rock and roll music. The LaRoucheites, they have a whole thing about, rock and roll music is mind control from the British Empire. Now, what's interesting is they're wrong in saying that, but they're not. It's like they have a whole bunch of the trees right, but they make it a forest that it's not exactly, right? We all know that, there was Elvis Presley in the United States, and then there was Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Chuck Berry, and there was like American rock and roll music, which was originally black people, and then they found various Southern white guys like Elvis who could sing black music. And that's why Elvis became popular, because they weren't going to allow black people to sing that music, but that kind of music was being popular, and Elvis was a white guy, a Southern white guy who could sing black music. And that's why why Elvis became famous. But and that was the same for like Buddy Holly and others. Chuck Berry was African American, etc. But then there was a wave in like the early 60s. There was a wave of rock and roll music they called the British Invasion. They called it the British Invasion. Why did they call it that? Well, in England, as a result of the growing popularity of rock and roll music in America, in England, there was an effort to cultivate rock and roll music that was more potent. This is very interesting to me, because it's like, so in Britain, the British record companies wanted to make a lot of money, and they saw that Elvis was popular in America, Buddy Holly, etc. So something called the Tavistock Institute, which really existed, right? And it was called the Tavistock Institute, and it was a psychological research center that worked with private corporations in Britain and had run psychological operations during the Second World War. The Tavistock Institute did all kinds of research to find out what it was that people liked about rock and roll music, why people got a thrill from listening to rock and roll music. And they did all kinds of experiments, marketing research. And then they found a way to amp it up. And they found the Beatles in particular, the Rolling Stones and others, and they amped up the punch of rock music because they wanted to make money. And they realized that rock and roll music, when you listen to it, it makes you kind of high. You get a thrill from listening to it. And they did marketing research about why does it do that? Why does rock and roll music make you high? And that there is a kind of hypnotic effect that rock and roll music has on you, which is why we all like it, right? Your favorite movie has a hypnotic effect on you too. I mean, that's art impacts you on a psychological level. I mean, there's nothing conspiratorial about saying that. So the Tavistock Institute helped the record companies in Britain develop a form of rock and roll music that was much more potent. And that's what the British Invasion of the early 1960s, Beatlemania, the Rolling Stones, Herman's Hermits, all of that was just basically they amped up all the hypnotic power of rock and roll music. So what's interesting is the Beatles toured the United States in the early 60s, and there was violence against them. And there was like violence. The Ku Klux Klan threatened them. They were shot at on stage and all of this, because if you went to a Beatles concert, it had like a hypnotic effect on people. People would be in a trance. People would be, because it was just so emotionally powerful. People, I mean, being in the room with the Beatles with that heavy, loud music playing and an audience of people screaming. You look at the videos of what they call Beatlemania, of those young girls like crying and screaming and all that. They are in a trance, right? And that there was an effort to kind of cultivate the power of rock and roll music to have a hypnotic psychological effect. It wasn't to make people, I don't think it necessarily served foreign policy goals. It was probably largely just to make money. But it was, and if you read William Sargent, The Mind Possessed, and all of that, it was an effort to amp up the hypnotic and psychological power of rock and roll music, and it was very effective. And the Tavistock Institute actually existed. A lot of the claims that are made about the Tavistock Institute are crazy, right? People claim that, Theodore Adorno actually wrote all the Beatles music. I've never found any proof of that. There's no proof of that. People claim that, but yes, there was something called the Tavistock Institute. That part is true. And that the Tavistock Institute was key in developing what we consider to be modern rock and roll music. And it did involve, amping up the emotional, psychological impact of rock and roll music. Rock and roll music originated in the United States, but British intelligence linked research institutes developed a much more potent and powerful form of rock music. And that's actually a very interesting story. And that's one thing I'll say about the LaRouche people is they'll say something that sounds crazy. But when you actually dig into it, there's a really interesting story there, right? Is rock and roll music a British psychological operation to brainwash the American people? Not exactly, but there is a link between British intelligence and rock and roll music, and the Tavistock Institute did exist, and all of that's true, and that's really interesting. So there's a really interesting story there. But if you just say to people, well, if and roll music is a British Empire conspiracy, they think, okay, that's cuckoo, and they ignore you, right? And there's similar things like this. If you say the Queen of England is a drug dealer, actually, there's a really interesting story there. The British Empire has used drugs, in particular opium, to control people. And the heroin trade. I mean, the China was subjected to 2 opium wars to force them to accept the importation of narcotics. And that everywhere the British set up shop, the heroin trade sets up. And that, HSBC Bank was a giant, heroin opium drug dealing bank. And that British intelligence, has used the drug trade and illegal drugs as a way to funnel money, as a way to control and enslave people. And there's actually a really interesting story there. However, if you go up to people and say, hey, the Queen of England's a big drug dealer, people laugh at you and they think of the Queen of England with bling bling and she's bust a cap in your ass, and they think that's stupid and all of that. And so that's one thing. I am not a LaRoucheist, and I have spelled out pretty clearly where my disagreements are. But LaRouche was absolutely right on a number of points. And he was way ahead of his time on a number of points. His understanding that growth versus degrowth would become the major divide in the ruling class. That was way ahead of his time. I mean, R. Palm Dutt says a similar thing in his book on fascism, but he doesn't exactly spell it out in the way LaRouche did. LaRouche understood that the new left was the tool of big capital, promoting degrowth and Malthusianism. That was right on point. It was right on point. There's a lot of ways that this is worth pointing out. And, in the next chapter, I talk about MK Ultra and mind control and things like that. And that, there's a lot here. And that's, again, it's kind of what I was talking about. They don't want there to be solid opposition. So they make it so you either just believe and blindly believe the establishment or you enter crazy land. The Tavistock Institute really existed. British intelligence and psychological research was involved in cultivating Beatles music. Those are facts. But when people mix that in with claims that Theodore Adorno actually wrote all the Beatles songs and stuff, then, there you get lost. So anyhow, all right. So we're going to start answering super chats. There's a few Rumble rants that have come in. Hempcar says, seeds have been linked to cancer and birth defects, an array of chemical, GMO, and pesticides. I'm open to believing that. I don't have an issue with that. Toxic effects such as heptic, pancreatic. Again, I don't know the research around GMOs. I don't trust Monsanto. But I also don't think there's something wrong with GMOs inherently. I don't trust Monsanto. I don't trust them with public health. I think they have way too much of a monopoly. That they basically have rigged the Food and Drug Administration so they can do whatever they want. So I don't trust the major corporations. But that said, I don't think that the idea of a GMO is inherently a problem. I believe that Monsanto is probably a lying corporation that has hurt. I mean, I know for a fact it's hurt millions of people. They're not concerned with public health, etc. So there you go. Now, Leo Messi is asking me, Elon Musk behavior explained. Elon Musk is a wealthy capitalist. I mean, he's a billionaire. Elon Musk has worked very hard to be the image of he has paid a lot of people to work on his image. And he wants to be kind of the image of a good capitalist, right? A lot of libertarians really hate Wall Street and they hate Goldman Sachs and they hate the big imperialist monopolies, but they love Andrew Carnegie and they love the steel manufacturer. What was his name? J.P. Morgan. And they love John D. Rockefeller, and they love like the industrial titans, the industrialists, the Wall Street industrialists of the 1800s, before capitalism had fully entered the imperialist stage, when you had a lot of wealthy industrialists. They loved them and they kind of romanticized them. And Ayn Rand, her novel Atlas Shrugged, her novel The Fountainhead, it also kind of glorifies and it makes it sound like these guys, these industrialists, they were pioneers, they were innovators. And to be fair, those guys believed in economic growth. Okay, they did believe in economic growth because they owned factories, right? Henry Ford is a similar case. He believed in economic growth. He was a capitalist. He was ruthless to his workers, very anti-union, but he wasn't a degrowther because he made money through economic growth. Bankers are where the degrowth stuff comes in, right? Industrialists, they're pro-growth. They're anti-union. They're a lot of awful things, but they are pro-economic growth, generally speaking. But Elon Musk he very much cultivates the image that he is an industrialist from the 1800s, that he is a non-conforming, self-made man, a creative genius who doesn't conform to the mob. Elon Musk wants you to see him as an Andrew Carnegie, or as a John Galt or Elon Musk or whatever. That's Elon Musk. Now, you'll notice that Donald Trump, when he was first running, was against electric cars. And when he spoke to the workers in Michigan, the auto workers who were on strike, he talked against electric cars and was against the Biden administration for pushing electric cars. But then Elon Musk came over to Trump's side, and now Trump loves electric cars. And that, look, Elon Musk, I don't trust him. I mean, but he seems more friendly to Russia than a lot of the capitalists are. He seems to be more pro-growth. He likes the space program. There are things about Elon Musk that make him slightly better than the bulk of his class and the bulk of the imperialist system. So I'll retweet him every so often when he says something I agree with. But at the same time, you just keep your eye on him, right? I mean, right now he's supporting Tommy Robinson, this awful Zionist hoodlum street thug in Britain who goes around beating up Muslims and just hates Muslims on an ethnic racial basis. He's supporting Tommy Robinson. I don't support Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson is an idiot. You listen to Tommy Robinson talk, he's an idiot, right? He's a dumb racist. I don't like Muslims, I saw a Muslim in my neighborhood. I said we ought to get together and beat him up, right? Them Muslims, they don't belong in the United Kingdom, right? And so I see me a Muslim and I punch him in the face. That's what I do. I'm Tommy Robinson. I'm smart. I am. I'm an intelligent man. That's why I hate people on the basis of their religion. And I go around beating them up. I started my organization, the English Defense League. I named it after the Jewish Defense League, that group of Zionist terrorists and hoodlums that went around beating up people who criticized Israel. That's what I am. I'm British, I am, and I don't like me Muslims. I like Israel because Israel kills Muslims, and I hate Muslims too. I'm a racist British guy. I'm Tommy Robinson, I am. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I mean, he's an idiot. You listen to Tommy Robinson talk, he's a fucking idiot. He's a racist fucking idiot. He's a Zionist. He's a supporter of Israel. He doesn't like Muslims, right? Muslims don't belong in the United Kingdom. If I see me a Muslim, I'm going to punch them in the face. I'm going to kick them with me boots. That's what I'm going to do. I'm Tommy Robinson, I am. Yes, sir. I mean, how can you support Tommy Robinson, right? I mean, he's just a dumb fuck. I mean, he's a dumb fuck, racist, violent bigot. I just don't have any admiration for Tommy Robinson whatsoever, right? And I am not one of those people that gets on the bandwagon of the cancel culture and, but Tommy Robinson is actually a racist. Tommy Robinson is actually a crazy Islamophobic Zionist. Tommy Robinson is actually an advocate of violence against Muslims. And he's also dumb as shit. You listen to any interview with him. He's like, I don't like Muslims, you see? And he's just a dumb idiot. He's just dumb. He's not intelligent. It's like, imagine like the dumbest racist Republican you've ever met who's like, all Muslims are actually terrorists. If you ever meet a Muslim who says they're not a terrorist, they're practicing taqiyya and they're lying to you and they're actually a terrorist. I've met these people in New York City, dumb Zionists who think every Muslim is in Al-Qaeda. And I'm like, no, they're not. Well, if they say they're not, they're practicing taqiyya. They're pretending to not be in Al-Qaeda because their religion says they can lie. It's like taqiyya is a Shia thing. And it's when Shia Muslims were being heavily persecuted, they developed a practice of operating in secret and operating in a clandestine manner. Taqiyya is a Shia thing, and it's more about practicing your religion in secret and developing a network of Shia Muslims who practice their religion in secret. It's not lying about what Muslims believe to get approval of liberals. That's not what it is. And the bulk of the Muslims in the West are Sunnis, and it's this whole thing. But there's this whole layer of people. It's like left over from the aftermath of 9/11. All Muslims are terrorists, man. It's like, no, they're not, right? And in fact, the terrorists are the ones the U.S. government supports, like I was talking about in my opening. So yeah, I see Elon Musk supporting Tommy Robinson. I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? So yeah, there you go. You're asking me about Elon Musk's behavior, and I'm telling you, I see Elon Musk supporting Tommy Robinson, and I'm rolling my eyes. But he says some good stuff about the media being against Trump and about Russia and stuff. So he's a mixed bag. And again, we need to pay attention to divisions in the ruling class. We need to be strategics, etc. The CIA used hip hop music in Cuba to create dissent. That is true. And there's a great book about that. There's a book that I have called Cuba Enters the Year 2000 that talks about the Cuban hip hop and the Cuban punk movement and how, Cuban rap music was manipulated. And there was a whole lot about that, actually. And that, a lot of the people involved in Cuban hip hop were not anti-Castro, but U.S. media really played up this idea. All these young Cubans are listening to hip hop music and they hate Fidel Castro and they hate communism. And the bulk of the young people who were doing it, they just liked hip hop music. And then the ones who were anti-Castro were getting funded by the American government and getting money given to them and stuff. So it's, it's kind of interesting. There's an interesting story there for sure. And that book by John Potash, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, is also a very good book about MK Ultra and stuff, which is the third chapter of this book gets into all of that, by the way. The third chapter of the book, I talk about MK Ultra, and we'll be reading that soon. I'm going to read this whole book and I'm going to cut it as an audio book. That's the way I do things. The book that gives the details about Cuban rap, it's like a section of the book. It's called Cuba Year 2000. What is it called? It's by Mark Frank, I think. Yeah, Cuba Looks to the Year 2000 by Mark Frank is the name of the book. It was published in 1993. Cuba Looks to the Year 2000 by Mark Frank. And here's the whole thing. You can get the PDF online. And I thought the section on Cuban hip hop and stuff was pretty good. Yeah, here's the PDF of the Cuba book. It's a Communist Party USA published book from 1993. Kind of like, where is Cuba at since the fall of the Soviet Union? It's a good book. Yeah, I recommend it. Yeah. So there you go. There you go. All right. So now we've answered the Rumble rants, right? We've answered all the Rumble rants. And now we will answer the super chat. CGTN reports South Korean authorities just tried to arrest the impeached president. I saw that, and that there's like people defending him, and it's a big mess. Yeah. I gotta feel sorry for that Yoon guy. I mean, he's on the wrong side, but I mean that guy majorly fucked up, right? And I want to know who told him he was going to have public support. I am convinced Joe Biden must have given him the go ahead. Nobody tries to pull off a military coup if they don't think they're going to win. And it looks like he had no chance in hell to pull that off. And so what made him think he could get away with it? Is he really that stupid? I don't think so. I think something's going on. Right? And I mean, he's fucked. That guy is fucked. He was going to leave office as an unpopular president already, but now, he's probably going to go to prison, right? He tried to have the military overthrow the government and it didn't work. And, what was going on there? Who gave him the go ahead to do that? I am convinced that this is because they're afraid of Trump moving ahead with the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. And that he is tied in with the war and the division in the military industrial complex, and he was afraid they're going to lose it all, and they're going to lose the military, the U.S. military being in South Korea and all of that, and that peace is going to move ahead on the Korean Peninsula. So we shall see what develops. We shall see. It's very clear that when it comes to Korea, that's a big point of division between Trump and Biden. Biden doesn't want peace on the Korean Peninsula. Trump does. So we'll see. We shall see. Mariah, I generally do not put out ebooks of my books. And the reason I don't do that is because I don't want people to go through them and quote mine them, which is what happens. I feel like if people buy a physical book, that's because they really want to read it. And that when there's ebooks, people buy them and they don't actually read them. They go through them to find quotes to use against me. And so I generally don't sell ebooks. I generally don't. So I generally make people buy the physical books. Also, because if you buy the physical book, it doesn't go away. It sits on your bookshelf and somebody else reads it. And I've had people who become fans of my work because somebody bought the green book and left it on their bookshelf, and they went to visit their friend, and they found the green book on their bookshelf and started reading it. And then they looked me up and they became fans of CPI. I mean, books have a longer life. They have a longer life. Physical books, generally do. But Mariah, since you're a supporter on Patreon, and since you are my friend, and since you are a member of CPI, as a courtesy to you, I will send you an ebook because I appreciate you and because you're a member of our community. I'm sending you the ebook right now. And that's one of the perks. If you're a member of the Patreon, you can have whatever books you want. If you're a member of the, if you're an active member of CPI and all of that, I generally take care of my people. But no, I don't generally publish ebooks. But Mariah, because you are a friend and all of that, and because you are a Patreon supporter, I will give you this benefit. So that's a sign for all of you. I will be streaming for the Patreon people soon. I do that at the beginning of every month. So I'm going to send you the book right now, the PDF, as a favor, because you are a beloved member of our community and because you've been so supportive. But generally, my books are only available in print, with certain exceptions. I was selling a PDF of the Kamala Harris book on Gumroad, and all of that. So Mariah, I'm sending you to your email the PDF of the book. So there you go. It's been sent to your email, Mariah, as a courtesy from our community. Sent with love. And there you go. All right, listen, folks, it's been a good night. Yeah, we're worried about the state of our country, obviously. But, big thing coming up. Donald Trump has taken office, and all the drama in the lead up to Trump taking office reinforces my belief that good things will happen in the Trump administration. Not saying it's going to completely change everything and, it's going to be, but I feel like all these crazy things wouldn't be happening as Trump is taking office if there wasn't a genuine, solid feeling on the part of the establishment that Trump would actually do some good things. None of this would be necessary. All the fireworks we're seeing right now would not be necessary if Trump wasn't actually going to do some good things. So let's hope that Trump actually does some good things in his administration. And if we're not prepared to loudly cheer and support every good thing that Trump does, we can't expect any good things to happen. We need to be strategic, right? And so we need to amplify the good things about Trump's message. We need to support, amplify, and promote Trump. So if you want to support what we're doing, donate to the inauguration fund, right? We're having our big event coming up. If you would like to support the work that we're doing, you want to send a donation, a great way to support us would be to donate to the inauguration fund. We're having this great anti-imperialist gathering in DC on Inauguration Day. It's going to be a wild day. It's going to be a wild, wild day in DC, so you can donate to the inauguration fund, because we have spent a lot of money on this event. It's going to be a rather expensive event that we are having in DC, but it's worth it because we want to make clear that we are, willing to be friendly to the new administration. If you do want to send me a donation on Cash App, that option does exist. Cash App, it's just Caleb Maupin 22 $. That's my Cash App. So if you want to donate to me on Cash App, that's another way, but you're not required to. Mariah, you've donated to our community. You're a supporter of our community, so you have no obligation. But yeah, if you want to help out CPI, donate to our Inauguration Day fund, because that event we're doing on Inauguration Day is going to be awesome, but it's also going to be quite expensive. So it's already been expensive, and we paid for it already. So it's going to be wild. So see you all in DC, and I'll be back soon. I'll be streaming again soon, as you all can be sure. Not sure when exactly. Might be tomorrow. But I'll be back. It's good to be here with all of you. It really is. Really is. And I appreciate all of you. And I'm glad we can have the rapport that we have and talk about things the way we do. So talk to you soon. Talk to y'all soon. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.